There exists within every woman a secret world that most never discover, a hidden realm where a young girl sits quietly in the shadows, holding the keys to everything she's been searching for. This isn't a metaphor or poetic imagery. This is the living reality of your psyche, where the most authentic parts of your feminine nature remain locked away, waiting for someone brave enough to venture into the darkness and bring them home. You've felt her presence, haven't you? In those moments when tears come without warning, when your heart aches for something you can't name, when you find yourself yearning for a kind of aliveness that feels just beyond your reach. She's the whisper that says, "This isn't who I really am," when you're performing the role of the strong, independent woman the world expects you to be. Modern neuroscience has revealed something extraordinary that Carl Jung intuited over a century ago. The experiences of our earliest years don't simply fade into memory, they become the very architecture of our adult emotional landscape. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's groundbreaking research shows that childhood experiences literally reshape brain structure, creating neural pathways that continue to influence how we perceive love, safety, and our own worth well into adulthood. But here's what most people don't understand about feminine psychology. When a girl learns to silence her authentic self, to survive in a world that demands conformity, she doesn't just lose access to her emotions, she loses connection to the wellspring of creativity, intuition, and magnetic presence that is her birthright. Jung called this the anima, the soul image that contains our deepest capacity for feeling, relationship, and spiritual connection. Today we're going to explore something that could fundamentally transform how you understand yourself as a woman. We're going to discover why healing the wounded aspects of your inner feminine isn't just about feeling better. It's about unlocking a way of being in the world that's so naturally powerful, so authentically magnetic, that it changes everything about how you move through life. The woman who learns to tend to her inner landscape with the same care she gives to everything else doesn't just heal her past. She becomes a force of nature. She becomes someone who no longer needs to chase love because she emanates it, who no longer needs to prove her worth because she embodies it, who no longer needs to perform femininity because she is femininity in its most essential form. The neurobiology of disconnection. Deep within the labyrinth of your nervous system lies a story that began before you could even speak. Researchers at Harvard Medical School have discovered that the developing brain is exquisitely sensitive to its emotional environment, with neural networks forming based on whether a child experiences the world as safe or threatening, loving or rejecting, attuned or dismissive. When a young girl encounters experiences that overwhelm her capacity to cope, whether through overt trauma or the more subtle wounds of emotional neglect, something profound happens in her developing psyche. The right hemisphere of her brain, which governs emotional processing, creativity, and intuitive knowing, begins to shut down as a protective mechanism. Meanwhile, the left hemisphere, focused on logic, analysis, and survival strategies, becomes hyperactive. This neurobiological split creates what Jung recognized as the fundamental wound of modern civilization, the disconnection from our own inner knowing. The girl who learns that her emotions are too much, that her sensitivity is weakness, that her natural expressiveness must be contained to be acceptable, doesn't consciously choose to abandon these parts of herself. Her nervous system makes this choice for her, prioritizing survival over authenticity. Dr. Dan Siegel's research on interpersonal neurobiology reveals that these early adaptations create what he calls implicit memories, bodily felt experiences that continue to shape our responses to intimacy, creativity, and self-expression without our conscious awareness. This is why a successful, accomplished woman might find herself inexplicably frozen when it comes to expressing her deepest needs in a relationship, or why someone who excels professionally might feel completely lost when trying to access her creative inspiration. The feminine psyche is particularly vulnerable to this kind of fragmentation because it naturally operates through connection, receptivity, and emotional attunement. When the developing girl learns that these qualities make her vulnerable to rejection or harm, she begins to construct what Jung called a persona, a protective mask that allows her to function in the world while keeping her most essential self hidden away. But this protective strategy comes at an enormous cost. Recent studies in epigenetics show that chronic emotional suppression actually alters gene expression, affecting everything from immune function to stress response to the ability to form secure attachments. The woman who has learned to live primarily from her protective persona often experiences a persistent sense of emptiness, a feeling that she's living someone else's life, a chronic fatigue that no amount of external achievement can cure. This is because maintaining the split between who you really are and who you've learned to be requires tremendous psychological energy. It's like trying to live with one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake. You might move forward, but you'll never experience the effortless flow that comes from being aligned with your authentic nature. Jung understood that this split isn't a personal failing. It's a natural response to an environment that couldn't hold the fullness of who you were meant to be. The girl who had to choose between authenticity and acceptance made the only choice available to her. But the woman she became now has options that weren't available to the child she once was. The architecture of feminine wounding. Within the landscape of analytical psychology, Jung identified patterns of wounding that are particularly relevant to the feminine experience. Unlike the more obvious traumas that leave clear marks, these wounds often manifest as a gradual erosion of self-trust, a subtle but persistent sense that something essential is missing from life. One of the most devastating patterns Jung observed was what he called the negative mother complex, not necessarily the result of having a literally harmful mother, but the internalization of messages that a girl's natural feminine qualities are somehow problematic. This might manifest as being told she's too emotional, too dramatic, too needy, or conversely, that she needs to be stronger, more independent, less sensitive. Contemporary research by Dr. Judith Herman on complex trauma reveals how these seemingly minor but repeated invalidations can be more psychologically damaging than single traumatic events. When a girl learns that her emotional reality is consistently misunderstood or dismissed, she begins to doubt her own perceptions, her own needs, her own worth. The wounded inner girl doesn't disappear when the woman achieves external success. Instead, she becomes what Jung called a complex, an autonomous cluster of memories, emotions, and beliefs that can suddenly take over consciousness when triggered. This is why an accomplished professional might find herself dissolved in tears over a friend's perceived slight, or why someone who navigates boardrooms with confidence might become tongue-tied when trying to express her feelings to someone she loves. These complexes operate like autonomous sub-personalities, each carrying their own agenda and their own version of reality. The good girl complex might drive perfectionism and people-pleasing. The strong woman complex might create an inability to receive help or show vulnerability. The invisible girl complex might manifest as chronic self-doubt and a tendency to minimize one's own achievements. Dr. Gabor Mate's work on trauma and authenticity shows how these early adaptations create what he calls scattered selves, fragments of personality that develop to cope with different threatening situations. For women, this often means learning to be different versions of themselves in different contexts, never feeling safe to show up as an integrated whole. The tragedy is that the very qualities the girl learned to hide or modify, her emotional intelligence, her intuitive knowing, her capacity for deep feeling, her natural creativity and expressiveness, are exactly the qualities that would make her most magnetic and powerful as an adult woman. But because they became associated with danger or rejection, they remain locked away in what Jung called the shadow. This shadow contains not just the wounded aspects of the inner girl, but also her gifts, her wisdom, her untamed joy, and her fierce capacity for love. Jung understood that true healing doesn't come from eliminating the shadow, but from learning to dialogue with it, to understand its messages, and ultimately to integrate its gifts back into conscious awareness. The woman who undertakes this work doesn't just heal old wounds. She reclaims parts of herself that have been waiting her entire lifetime to be expressed. She discovers that beneath the protective layers lies not weakness or damage, but a wellspring of creative power that's been waiting for permission to flow. The sacred return to wholeness, Jung's concept of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are rather than who you think you should be, offers a roadmap for this sacred return. But individuation for women involves a particular challenge, learning to value and integrate the very qualities that patriarchal culture has systematically devalued. This process begins with what Jung called active imagination, the practice of consciously engaging with the unconscious contents of the psyche. For women seeking to heal their relationship with their feminine essence, This might involve quite literally having conversations with the inner girl who holds their authentic power. Modern research on internal family systems therapy, developed by Dr. Richard Schwartz, validates Jung's insights about the multiplicity of the psyche. Studies show that people who learn to develop a loving, curious relationship with their various internal parts experience significant improvements in emotional regulation, self-compassion, and the capacity for authentic relationship. The woman who begins to turn toward her inner landscape with curiosity, rather than judgment, often discovers that the parts of herself she's been trying to fix or transcend are actually carrying important messages. The part that feels too sensitive might be holding her capacity for profound empathy and intuitive knowing. The part that feels too emotional might be the gateway to her creative genius. The part that feels too much might be the source of her magnetic presence and ability to inspire others. But this integration process requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. The modern woman must learn to be both strong and vulnerable, independent and connected, rational and intuitive. This isn't about finding balance. It's about developing the capacity to access different aspects of herself as situations require, without losing her essential core. Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Este, in her work on feminine psychology, describes this as returning to the wild woman, not the stereotypical image of wildness as chaotic or destructive, but wildness as natural, authentic, untamed by societal expectations. The wild woman is the one who trusts her instincts, who follows her creative impulses, who sets boundaries based on her own knowing rather than others' approval. This return to wholeness often requires grieving, mourning the years spent in disconnection, the opportunities missed while living from a false self, the relationships that couldn't reach their full depth because authentic intimacy wasn't possible. Jung understood that this grief is not pathological but sacred, a necessary part of releasing what was never truly ours to carry. As women begin to reclaim their inner landscape, they often experience what Jung called enantiodromia, a swing toward the opposite of what they've been living. The woman who has been overly accommodating might discover her capacity for healthy anger. The one who has been emotionally shut down might find herself flooded with feeling. This isn't regression, it's recalibration, the psyche's attempt to find its natural balance. The ultimate goal isn't to become a different person, but to become more fully yourself. Jung believed that each individual has what he called a self with a capital S, an innate pattern of wholeness that serves as an internal guidance system. For women, reconnecting with this self often means learning to trust the subtle wisdom of the body, the quiet knowing of intuition, the creative intelligence that emerges when the mind stops trying to control everything. The embodied path of healing. Understanding feminine psychology intellectually is only the beginning. True transformation requires what Jung called lived experience, the willingness to feel, to explore, to experiment with new ways of being in the world. The journey back to feminine authenticity is inherently embodied, requiring a woman to trust sensations, emotions, and instincts that may have been silenced for decades. Research by Dr. Peter Levine on somatic experiencing reveals that trauma recovery requires engaging the body's innate wisdom. For women healing their relationship with their feminine essence, this often means learning to distinguish between the contracted, hyper-vigilant state of the protective persona and the relaxed, open, naturally rhythmic state of their authentic self. The practice begins with something deceptively simple, learning to breathe into the belly rather than the chest, allowing the diaphragm to move freely, creating space for emotions to flow rather than being held in muscular tension. Many women discover that they've been breathing in a way that maintains alertness and control for so long that they've forgotten how to let their nervous system truly relax. Movement becomes medicine when it's approached not as exercise, but as a conversation with the body's wisdom. Dance, yoga, or even simple stretching can become opportunities to explore what it feels like to move from pleasure rather than productivity, from internal impulse rather than external instruction. The woman who has learned to override her body's signals often discovers that it has been trying to communicate important information all along. Creative expression offers another pathway back to authenticity. Jung encouraged his patients to paint, draw, write, or create without any agenda other than expressing what was alive in them. Modern research on expressive arts therapy shows that creative engagement activates the right hemisphere of the brain, facilitating integration between conscious and unconscious aspects of experience. The key is approaching creativity not as performance, but as conversation, a dialogue between the conscious mind and the deeper currents of the psyche. The woman who allows herself to create badly, to make marks on paper or sounds with her voice without needing them to be good or meaningful, often discovers that something profound emerges when perfectionism is no longer guarding the gate. Touch and pleasure also become important elements of healing. Many women who have experienced feminine wounding have learned to disconnect from their bodies as a protective mechanism. Learning to appreciate sensory pleasure, the warmth of sunlight on skin, the texture of fabric, the taste of food, can be a radical act of reclamation. This doesn't necessarily mean anything sexual, though for some women healing their relationship with their sexuality becomes an important part of reclaiming their feminine power. It's more about learning to inhabit the body as a source of wisdom and pleasure, rather than something to be controlled, hidden, or transcended. Dr. Christiane Northrup's research on women's bodies and women's wisdom shows that when women learn to trust their physical sensations and cyclical rhythms, they often discover a natural intelligence that conventional education never taught them to value. The body knows when to rest and when to act, when to speak and when to listen, when to give and when to receive. Reclaiming the language of the heart. One of the most profound aspects of feminine healing involves learning to speak in what Jung called the language of the soul, a way of communicating that honors feeling, relationship, and meaning, rather than just facts and logic. For many women, this means literally learning new vocabulary for their inner experience. Dr. Mark Brackett's research on emotional intelligence reveals that people who can identify and articulate their emotions with precision have better relationships, make better decisions, and experience greater overall well-being. But many women discover that their emotional vocabulary was stunted in childhood, when their feelings were dismissed, minimized, or pathologized. Reclaiming this language requires patience and curiosity. Instead of the broad categories of fine, upset, or stressed, the woman on a healing journey learns to distinguish between longing and grief, between anger and hurt, between fear and excitement. She learns that emotions often come in complex combinations, feeling grateful and sad simultaneously, or experiencing love and disappointment in the same moment. This precision in emotional language becomes a tool for deeper intimacy, both with oneself and others. When a woman can say, "I feel vulnerable and scared of being hurt, and I also feel drawn to you and want to open my heart," she creates space for authentic connection that wouldn't be possible with vaguer expressions. The practice extends beyond emotional vocabulary to include what Jung called symbolic thinking, the ability to recognize that dreams, fantasies, and even everyday experiences often carry deeper meaning. The woman who learns to ask, "What might this situation be trying to teach me?" or "What part of me is being activated right now?" develops a relationship with life that's richer and more meaningful than purely rational analysis can provide. Storytelling becomes particularly important in this process. Jung understood that humans are fundamentally storytelling creatures, and that healing often involves changing the narrative we tell ourselves about our lives. Instead of seeing herself as damaged or broken, the woman on a healing journey learns to see herself as someone who survived difficult circumstances and is now ready to reclaim her authentic power. This reframing isn't about positive thinking or denying difficult experiences. It's about recognizing that the very qualities that may have been seen as problematic, sensitivity, emotional depth, the need for connection, are actually indicators of a rich inner life and a capacity for profound engagement with existence. The woman who learns to honor her own story, to see the wisdom in her wounds and the strength in her survival, begins to carry herself differently in the world. She speaks with more authority because she's connected to her own truth. She sets boundaries more naturally because she trusts her own perceptions. She creates more magnetic relationships because she's no longer hiding fundamental aspects of who she is. The ripple effects of authentic feminine power. When a woman begins to heal her relationship with her inner feminine, the transformation extends far beyond her personal experience. Jung understood that individual healing contributes to collective healing, and this is particularly true when it comes to feminine consciousness. The woman who learns to trust her intuition gives other women permission to trust theirs. The one who expresses her emotions authentically creates space for others to do the same. The one who honors her creative impulses inspires others to explore their own artistic longings. There's a contagious quality to authenticity that spreads through relationships and communities in ways that can't be predicted or controlled. Research by Dr. Shelley Taylor on tend and befriend responses shows that women naturally have a different stress response pattern than men, one that emphasizes connection and mutual support rather than fight or flight. When women heal their capacity for healthy relationship with themselves and others, they often become natural leaders and healers in their communities. But this leadership looks different from the masculine model of authority and control. It's more organic, more relational, more responsive to the needs of the moment. The woman who has integrated her feminine wisdom knows when to speak and when to listen, when to act and when to wait, when to give and when to receive. She becomes what Jung called a wounded healer, someone whose own healing journey becomes a source of wisdom and compassion for others. Professional life often transforms as well. The woman who has reclaimed her authentic feminine power often finds that her work becomes more aligned with her values, more creative, more meaningful. She may discover entrepreneurial impulses she never knew she had, or find ways to bring more heart and creativity into traditional career paths. The integration of feminine consciousness also affects romantic relationships profoundly. The woman who no longer needs to hide her emotional depth or her need for connection often attracts partners who can match her authenticity. She becomes less likely to settle for relationships that require her to diminish herself, and more skilled at creating the kind of intimacy that nourishes both people. Perhaps most importantly, the woman who heals her feminine wounds often becomes a different kind of mother, whether to biological children or to the younger people in her life. She models emotional intelligence, creative expression, and the courage to be authentic. She creates space for the children around her to remain connected to their own inner wisdom rather than having to abandon it for acceptance. Dr. Sue Johnson's research on attachment shows that secure relationships are characterized by emotional accessibility, responsiveness, and engagement. The woman who has learned to be emotionally accessible to herself naturally becomes more emotionally available to others, creating ripple effects of healing that can span generations. This doesn't mean becoming everyone's therapist or caretaker. In fact, true feminine power includes the wisdom to know when helping someone requires allowing them to struggle with their own growth, rather than rescuing them from necessary learning experiences. It's a mature, boundaried kind of compassion that serves the highest good rather than just providing temporary comfort. The daily practice of feminine reclamation healing. The feminine doesn't happen through occasional insights or peak experiences alone. It requires what Jung called daily work, small, consistent practices that gradually shift the nervous system from protective vigilance to natural flow, from performance to authenticity, from disconnection to embodied presence. One of the most powerful practices involves learning to check in with your inner landscape, the way you might check the weather, not to control it, but to dress appropriately for the conditions. This might mean taking a few moments each morning to sense into your body, your emotions, your energy level, and making decisions about the day that honor what you discover. For the woman who has learned to override her natural rhythms in service of productivity, this practice can be revolutionary. She might discover that she has natural cycles of expansion and contraction, times when she's naturally more outgoing and creative, and times when she needs more solitude and reflection. Honoring these rhythms often leads to greater overall effectiveness as well as improved well-being. The practice of emotional regulation becomes less about controlling feelings and more about creating space for them to move through naturally. This might involve breathwork, movement, journaling, or simply allowing tears to flow when they arise without immediately trying to stop them or figure out what they mean. Many women discover that they've been holding emotions in their body for years. Grief in the chest, anger in the jaw, fear in the belly. Learning to breathe into these areas, to move them gently, to speak to them with compassion, often allows old emotional charge to release naturally. Boundary setting becomes an art form rather than a battle. The woman who is connected to her inner wisdom often knows instinctively when something feels right or wrong for her. She learns to trust these instincts even when she can't justify them logically, understanding that her intuitive knowing is often more accurate than her analytical mind. This doesn't mean becoming rigid or uncompromising. It means developing what Jung called conscious choice, the ability to say yes or no from a place of clarity rather than unconscious conditioning. The woman who can set boundaries from love rather than fear often finds that others respond more respectfully than when boundaries come from anger or resentment. Creative expression becomes a form of prayer, a way of staying connected to the deeper currents of life that flow beneath the surface of daily activities. This might be as simple as humming while cooking, or as elaborate as dedicating time each week to painting, writing, or dancing. The key is approaching creativity as a relationship rather than a performance. Physical self-care takes on new meaning when it's approached as a way of honoring the body's wisdom rather than forcing it to conform to external standards. This might mean eating foods that feel nourishing rather than following strict dietary rules, moving in ways that feel pleasurable rather than punishing, dressing in ways that feel expressive rather than appropriate. Sleep becomes sacred time for integration and renewal rather than something to minimize in service of productivity. Many women discover that their dream life becomes richer and more meaningful when they begin to value the unconscious wisdom that emerges during rest. The courage to be seen. Perhaps the greatest challenge in feminine healing is learning to be visible in your authenticity, to let others see not just your competence and strength, but also your vulnerability, your uncertainty, your need for connection and support. For many women, this requires unlearning deeply ingrained messages about what makes them lovable or valuable. The process often begins with small experiments in authenticity. Instead of automatically saying "I'm fine" when someone asks how you are, you might risk sharing something more honest. "I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed today, but I'm managing." Instead of pretending to understand something when you don't, you might admit your confusion and ask for clarification. These small acts of truth-telling can feel terrifying at first, especially for women who learned early that their authentic selves were somehow problematic. But they often lead to unexpected discoveries about how others respond to genuineness. Many women find that people are actually drawn to authenticity, that vulnerability creates intimacy in ways that perfection never can. The practice extends to professional settings as well. The woman who learns to speak from her authentic perspective, rather than saying what she thinks others want to hear, often discovers that her unique viewpoint is exactly what was missing from important conversations. She may find that her natural collaborative style, or her ability to consider emotional and relational factors alongside logical ones, makes her invaluable in leadership roles. This doesn't mean becoming inappropriately personal or emotional in professional contexts. It means bringing your full intelligence, including emotional and intuitive intelligence, to your work rather than artificially constraining yourself to purely rational analysis. Physical presence also shifts as women reclaim their authentic power. Instead of making themselves small or invisible, they learn to take up appropriate space. Instead of moving through the world in a defensive crouch, they discover how to stand and walk with natural confidence. Instead of hiding their bodies or their sensuality, they learn to appreciate and express their physical presence appropriately. The woman who has healed her relationship with her feminine essence often discovers that she has a natural magnetism that doesn't depend on conventional beauty standards or seductive behavior. It's more about being fully alive, fully present, fully herself. People are drawn to this quality of aliveness because it's increasingly rare in a world that encourages emotional numbing and authentic disconnection. Learning to receive compliments, support, and love becomes another crucial practice. Many women discover that they've become experts at giving but struggle to receive. They deflect compliments, refuse help, and have difficulty accepting affection even from people they trust. Healing these patterns often requires consciously practicing saying thank you instead of minimizing praise, and allowing others to contribute to their well-being instead of insisting on complete self-sufficiency. This receptivity is not weakness. It's actually a sophisticated form of strength that allows for the kind of interdependence that makes life rich and meaningful. The woman who can both give and receive, who can both lead and follow, who can both support others and allow herself to be supported, has access to a fuller range of human experience. Integration and embodiment. As the healing journey progresses, the goal shifts from fixing problems to integrating wisdom, from eliminating unwanted aspects of self to including them in a larger wholeness. Jung called this process the union of opposites. learning to hold seemingly contradictory qualities in creative tension rather than choosing one or the other. The woman who has done this work can be both fierce and gentle, depending on what the situation requires. She can be deeply feeling and clearly thinking, passionately engaged and serenely centered, intimately connected and appropriately boundaried. These aren't contradictions to be resolved, but complementary aspects of a fully realized human being. This integration shows up in decision-making as a natural wisdom that considers multiple factors simultaneously: logic and intuition, individual needs and relational impact, immediate concerns and long-term consequences. The woman who has access to her full intelligence makes decisions that honor both her authentic desires and her genuine care for others. Relationships become laboratories for practicing this integrated way of being. Instead of choosing between being autonomous or connected, she learns to maintain her individual integrity while also creating deep intimacy. Instead of choosing between being supportive or honest, she discovers how to offer truth as a form of love. The capacity for what Jung called conscious suffering develops as well. The ability to feel pain without being overwhelmed by it, to witness difficulty without immediately trying to fix or escape it. This isn't masochistic or passive, but rather a mature recognition that some experiences require simply being with what is, allowing natural processes of healing and transformation to unfold in their own time. Creative expression evolves from a practice to a way of being. The woman who has integrated her feminine wisdom brings creativity to everything she does: parenting, work, relationships, even mundane tasks like cooking or organizing. She understands that creativity isn't just about art, but about bringing fresh perspective and authentic engagement to whatever life presents. Service to others becomes more natural and sustainable because it flows from overflow rather than emptiness. The woman who has learned to tend to her own inner landscape has genuine resources to offer others. Her service comes from joy and abundance rather than duty or guilt, making it more effective and less depleting. The relationship with aging and mortality also shifts. Instead of seeing growing older as loss of value or attractiveness, the woman who has reclaimed her essential nature understands that her worth doesn't depend on youth or conventional beauty. She may discover that she becomes more beautiful, more magnetic, more powerful as she ages because she's becoming more fully herself. This doesn't mean denying the realities of physical aging or pretending that cultural ageism doesn't exist. It means recognizing that true feminine power comes from depth of being rather than surface appearance, from wisdom earned through experience rather than innocence or naivety. The woman who has integrated her feminine essence often becomes what Jung called a wise woman, someone who has transformed her wounds into wisdom, her pain into compassion, her struggle into strength. She becomes a resource for others not by being perfect, but by being whole, not by having all the answers, but by being willing to live the questions with grace and courage. The sacred rebellion of authenticity. In a world that profits from women's disconnection from their own power, living authentically becomes a revolutionary act. The woman who refuses to abandon herself for acceptance, who insists on honoring her inner wisdom, who creates from her genuine inspiration rather than external expectations, challenges systems that depend on compliance and conformity. This isn't about becoming rebellious in a reactive way, but about what Jung called conscious rebellion, choosing authenticity not as an act of defiance, but as an act of love for life itself. The woman who lives this way becomes a beacon for others who are ready to remember their own forgotten wholeness. The healing of feminine consciousness isn't just personal therapy, it's a contribution to the healing of the world. When women reclaim their connection to intuition, emotion, creativity, and relational wisdom, they bring these gifts into families, communities, organizations, and cultures that desperately need them. The challenges facing humanity, environmental destruction, social fragmentation, the epidemic of depression and anxiety, all reflect in part a disconnection from the qualities that healthy feminine consciousness provides: the ability to sense into consequences, to prioritize relationship over competition, to value being alongside doing, to honor cyclical rather than linear time. As more women heal their relationship with their own feminine nature, they become natural leaders in creating more sustainable, compassionate, connected ways of living. They model emotional intelligence, creative problem-solving, and the courage to choose love over fear even in difficult circumstances. This leadership often looks different from traditional models of authority. It's more circular than hierarchical, more collaborative than competitive, more responsive than reactive. It honors process as much as outcome, relationship as much as achievement, wisdom as much as knowledge. The woman who has reclaimed her feminine essence understands that true power comes not from domination, but from alignment, with her own truth, with natural rhythms, with the deeper intelligence that flows through all life. She becomes what Jung envisioned as an individuated person, someone who has become consciously whole and can therefore contribute to the evolution of human consciousness. Your inner girl hasn't been waiting all these years to be fixed, improved, or transcended. She's been waiting to be welcomed home, to be seen and celebrated for the wisdom she carries, to be allowed to infuse your adult life with the qualities that make existence magical, rather than merely manageable. The woman who undertakes this sacred return doesn't just heal her past, she transforms her future and contributes to the healing of the world. The journey back to feminine authenticity isn't always easy, but it's always worthwhile. Every moment you choose to honor your inner wisdom over external expectations, every time you trust your intuition over conventional logic, every instance you allow yourself to feel deeply, rather than numbing out, you're not just healing yourself, you're participating in a collective remembering of what it means to be fully alive. Your feminine essence has been waiting patiently for you to remember that you were never broken, never too much, never fundamentally flawed. You were simply a sensitive soul trying to survive in a world that hadn't yet learned to honor the gifts you came here to share. Now is the time to reclaim those gifts, to let them flow through you and bless everyone whose life you touch with the irreplaceable medicine of a woman who has remembered who she really is.